December 18, 1944. 11:47 p.m. The Malmedy Road, Belgium. Staff Sergeant Frank Audrey stood in knee-deep snow, staring at what should have been impossible. Stretched out before him, along 4 miles of frozen, desolate Belgian road, were 47 American M4 Sherman tanks. They were abandoned, immobilized, some still smoking faintly from engine fires, others listing on broken tracks. They were a steel graveyard, a monument to the chaos of the last 48 hours. Behind them, less than 8 miles away and closing, German Panzer divisions were advancing through the Ardennes forest. The order from division headquarters was clear, unequivocal, and tactically sound. Destroy all disabled vehicles to prevent enemy capture. Thermite grenades were already being distributed. Engineers were setting their demolition charges. But Frank couldn't do it. He had spent 18 months of his life keeping these very machines alive. He knew every engine, every transmission, every individual quirk and failure point. And he knew something that the commanders in their warm headquarters didn't. Most of these tanks weren't dead. They were just cold. Frozen fuel lines, seized transmissions, and dead batteries from the sub-zero temperatures. Problems that could be fixed if someone was brave enough or crazy enough to break every regulation in the book to do it. Frank looked at his 2-man crew, both shivering, both exhausted, both waiting for his orders. "We're not blowing them up," he said quietly. His assistant, Private Eddie Kowalski, stared at him. "Sarge," they said, "destroy everything. If the Germans get these tanks." "They won't," Frank interrupted, his voice firm. "Because we're taking them back." What followed over the next 36 hours was one of the most audacious, unauthorized, and technically brilliant recovery operations of the Second World War. Against direct orders, with no official support, Frank Audrey and his makeshift crew of 2 would hotwire, jumpstart, tow, and jury-rig 47 supposedly destroyed Sherman tanks back from the edge of German capture, using methods that violated every Army regulation and would either earn him a court-martial or save an entire armored division. This is the true story of how one man's refusal to follow orders, and his deep, intuitive knowledge of machines over manuals, turned what should have been America's greatest equipment loss in the Battle of the Bulge into its most unlikely recovery. Frank Audrey wasn't supposed to be in the Army at all. Born in 1919 in Detroit, Michigan, he grew up just 3 blocks from the Ford River Rouge complex, the largest industrial facility in the world. His father worked the assembly line for 22 years. His mother packed her own lunch in the same metal tin for a decade because money was tight and waste was a sin. Frank learned to fix things before he learned to read. At age 7, he rebuilt a neighbor's lawnmower using parts from a discarded washing machine. At 12, he was pulling apart Model A engines in his backyard, teaching himself valve timing and carburetor adjustment. By 16, he was working nights at a salvage yard, buying broken equipment for pennies and reselling it, repaired, for dollars. He had a gift, the kind you can't teach in schools. He could hear what was wrong with an engine just by listening to it idle. He could diagnose a transmission failure by the smell of the fluid. Other mechanics followed manuals. Frank followed instinct. When the war started, Frank tried to enlist as a pilot. The recruiter laughed. "You're 5'6" and you wear glasses. You're not flying anything." So, he enlisted as a mechanic, figuring if he couldn't fight from the sky, he'd keep the machines running on the ground. He shipped to North Africa in 1942 with the 3rd Armored Maintenance Battalion, and within weeks, he'd become the guy everyone went to when the rulebook didn't have an answer. He once kept a Stuart tank running for 3 days using a fan belt from a captured German vehicle and engine oil drained from a wrecked Italian truck. He repaired a blown transmission by hand fabricating a new gear from a bulldozer part that wasn't even supposed to fit. Officers didn't always like him. He talked back. He questioned orders. He had a habit of fixing things his own way, which usually meant the unauthorized way. But the tank crews loved him, because when Frank worked on your Sherman, it came back running better than it had when it left the factory. By December 1944, Frank had been transferred to the 2nd Armored Division, stationed in Belgium. He was 25 years old, wore oil-stained coveralls even when off duty, and had a reputation as the man who could resurrect dead tanks. That reputation was about to be tested in the coldest, most chaotic conditions imaginable. On December 16, 1944, the Germans launched Operation Walk am Rhein, Hitler's last, desperate gamble in the West. A massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest designed to split the Allied lines and recapture the port of Antwerp. Over 200,000 German troops, 1,000 tanks, and 2,000 artillery pieces smashed into the thinly held American positions. It was a complete and total surprise. Fog and heavy snow grounded the all-powerful Allied aircraft. Radio communications were jammed or intercepted. American units, spread thin and completely unprepared for winter warfare, were overrun or cut off within hours. In the chaos, fuel convoys were ambushed, supply lines were severed, and entire battalions found themselves surrounded. For the 2nd Armored Division, the first 48 hours were a nightmare. Tanks that had been advancing toward Germany just days earlier were now in a fighting retreat through frozen mud and snow. The weather was brutal. Temperatures dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, then lower. Snow fell continuously. Ice formed on everything: roads, equipment, gun barrels, even the inside of the tank hatches. And the cold did something no German shell could do. It killed machines. Diesel fuel gelled in the tanks. Engine oil thickened to the consistency of molasses. Batteries, already old and overworked, died overnight. Tracks froze solid to the ground. Entire columns of Shermans simply stopped moving, stranded along roadsides, unable to start, unable to retreat. By December 18, the division's maintenance crews were completely overwhelmed. Dozens of tanks had been abandoned along the Malmedy Road as units fell back toward Bastogne. Some had mechanical failures, others had run out of fuel. A few had been hit by German fire but were still reparable. The command made a decision that was, by the book, tactically sound: destroy them. Better to deny the enemy 50 tanks than to risk them being captured and turned against American forces. Demolition teams were dispatched with orders to place thermite grenades inside the engine compartments, melt the transmissions, and render the vehicles permanently unusable. It was standard procedure. It made tactical sense. But it made Frank Audrey sick to his stomach. Frank received the order at 10:30 p.m. on December 18. He was in a supply depot just east of Spa, trying to sleep on a cot in a storage tent, when a lieutenant woke him. Audrey, Division wants all disabled vehicles along the Malmedy Road destroyed by dawn. Take your crew, set the charges. Get it done. Frank sat up, wiping the grease from his face. Destroyed? How many vehicles? 47 Shermans, last count. Maybe more. The Germans are 8 miles out. We can't let them capture our armor. Most of those tanks aren't combat disabled, Frank said carefully. They're cold disabled. Frozen fuel, dead batteries. I can fix. You can't fix 47 tanks in 12 hours, the lieutenant interrupted. And we don't have 12 hours. Destroy them. That's an order. Frank didn't argue. He just nodded, pulled on his boots, and walked out into the swirling snow. Eddie Kowalski and Corporal Jimmy Driscoll, his two-man crew, were waiting by their half-track, its engine running, exhaust steaming in the night air. We blowing up tanks tonight? Eddie asked, his breath fogging. Frank climbed into the half-track and sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the dashboard. Then he looked at them both. How much cable do we have? Jimmy blinked. Tow cable? Maybe 300 feet. Why? Because we're not destroying anything, Frank said. We're recovering them. Eddie's eyes widened. Sarge, that's a direct violation. I know what it is, Frank cut him off. But I also know those tanks. I've worked on half of them. They're not dead. They're salvageable. And I am not going to blow up perfectly good American armor just because it's cold outside. Division will court-martial you, Jimmy said quietly. Frank shrugged. Maybe. But if the Germans capture 47 Shermans because we were too lazy to try, that's on us. I'd rather face a court-martial than live with that. There was a long silence. Then Eddie grinned. All right, Sarge. What's the plan? Frank pulled a crumpled map from his jacket. We've got maybe 6 hours before dawn. The Germans are here, he pointed. The disabled tanks are strung along this road. We start at the farthest point and work our way backward. Every tank we can start, we drive out. Every tank we can't start, we tow. We bypass anything that's truly destroyed. With 3 guys and 1 half-track, Jimmy said flatly. Frank nodded. With 3 guys and 1 half-track. Eddie laughed, shaking his head. This is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Probably, Frank admitted. But it might just work. They reached the first Sherman at 11:52 p.m. It sat alone in a snowdrift, its turret traversed left, its engine silent, no visible damage, no burn marks, just cold and dead. Frank climbed out, flashlight in hand, and approached the tank carefully. The hatch was frozen shut. He banged on it with a wrench until the ice cracked, then pried it open. Inside, the crew compartment was a frozen tomb. Frost coated the radio. Ice had formed on the ammunition racks. The air smelled of cold diesel and metal. Frank climbed in and sat in the driver's seat. He turned the ignition key. Nothing. Not even a click. Dead battery. He checked the fuel gauge, half full. He opened the engine access panel and shone his light inside. The oil on the dipstick was so thick with cold it barely moved. The fuel lines were stiff. But the engine itself looked intact. This one's recoverable, Frank called out. Eddie climbed up. How? The battery's dead. We jump it, Frank said. He moved the half-track into position and pulled out a set of jumper cables, homemade, cobbled together from welding wire and battery clamps. It wasn't regulation equipment. Frank had built it himself months ago after watching too many tanks fail to start in cold weather. He connected the cables from the half-track's battery to the Sherman's terminals, then climbed back into the tank. Hit the starter. The half-track's engine revved. Frank turned the key. The Sherman's starter motor groaned, slow and sluggish. It turned over once, twice, then caught. The engine coughed, belched black smoke, and roared to life. Eddie whooped. Frank let the engine idle for 30 seconds, warming the oil, then revved it twice. The transmission was stiff but functional. He engaged the clutch, shifted into first gear, and the Sherman lurched forward, its tracks crunching through the snow. 1 down, Frank muttered. 46 to go. What Frank did over the next 6 hours wasn't combat. It wasn't heroism in the traditional sense. It was pure, frantic mechanical problem-solving under impossible conditions, executed with speed, precision, and a total disregard for the rules. He developed a system, an assembly line in the snow. At each tank, he'd assess it in under 2 minutes. Engine intact? Fuel present? Tracks mobile? If yes to all 3, it was recoverable. If the battery was dead, he'd jump it from the half-track or from another tank they'd already started. If the fuel lines were frozen, he'd heat them with a blowtorch he'd borrowed from a supply depot weeks earlier. If the tracks were frozen solid to the ground, he'd use the half-track to yank them loose. If the engine oil was too thick, he'd drain a quart and replace it with thinner oil scavenged from abandoned vehicles. It was brutal, freezing work. His hands went numb. His fingers bled from torn gloves. Eddie and Jimmy worked without stopping, running cables, carrying tools, climbing in and out of icy hatches in the dark. They didn't have time to do things properly. They did them fast. 1 tank had a blown track. They couldn't repair it, so Frank hooked it to the back of a running Sherman and towed it. Another had a seized transmission. He bypassed the clutch entirely, rigging a manual override using a crowbar wedged into the linkage so the driver could shift gears by hand. A 3rd tank had no fuel. Frank siphoned diesel from 2 other disabled vehicles using a rubber hose and his own lungs, spitting out mouthfuls of fuel between tanks. This is insane, Jimmy coughed, wiping his mouth. This is Detroit, Frank replied, not missing a beat. By 3 a.m., they had 12 tanks running. By 4:30 a.m., 23. The convoy of resurrected machines grew. Tanks that had been silent and dead were now idling in a long line, their engines rumbling, headlights off, waiting. Some limped, some smoked, but they moved. At one point, Eddie asked, "What if command sees this? They're going to know we didn't blow them up." Frank didn't look up from the fuel pump he was repairing. "Then we better have all 47 running before they figure it out." At 5:17 a.m., headlights appeared on the road behind them. Frank froze. An American Jeep. It pulled up fast and a major stepped out, his face a mask of fury. "What the hell is going on here? These tanks were supposed to be destroyed hours ago." Frank stood, wrench in hand, his face black with oil. "Sir, we're in the process of recovering them." "Recovering?" The major's voice rose. "Sergeant, you were ordered to destroy these vehicles." "Yes, sir. But they're recoverable. Most of them just needed—" "I don't care what they needed," the major stepped closer. "The Germans are less than 10 miles from here. If they reach this position and find 47 operational tanks waiting for them, you've just handed Hitler the equipment to kill our own men." Frank met his eyes. "Sir, with respect, if we destroy these tanks, we lose them forever. If I can get them running, we can move them back to friendly lines. We're already halfway done. Halfway done with an unauthorized operation that violates direct orders." The major turned to Eddie and Jimmy. "Who authorized this?" They said nothing. The major turned back to Frank. "Sergeant Audrey, you're looking at a court-martial." Frank nodded. "Yes, sir. But if I get these tanks out, it's worth it." The major stared at him for a long, tense moment. Then he looked at the improbable line of idling Shermans, their exhaust steaming in the pre-dawn cold. He shook his head in disbelief. "How many can you move?" "All of them," Frank said. "If we have 2 more hours." The major checked his watch. "You have 1 hour. After that, German scouts will be in range. If you're still here, they'll kill you and take the tanks anyway." "Understood." "Yes, sir." The major climbed back into his jeep, paused, then looked back. "Sergeant, if you pull this off, I'll forget this conversation ever happened. If you don't, I'll make sure your court-martial is the least of your problems." He drove off into the darkness. Eddie exhaled a cloud of frosted air. That went well. Frank was already moving to the next tank. The final push. They had 1 hour and 17 tanks left. Frank abandoned all caution. He jump-started 3 tanks simultaneously, using tow chains to connect their batteries in series, creating a makeshift power grid that would have made any electrical engineer scream. He bypassed safety systems, disabled engine governors, and overrode temperature sensors. One tank had a cracked cylinder head. He stuffed the crack with epoxy and electrical tape, fired it up, and told the driver who they pulled from another crew, "Don't stop. Don't idle. Just drive." Another had no brakes. "Use the transmission to slow down. If you crash, crash forward." A third had a damaged fuel pump. Frank rigged a hand pump from a Jeep's windshield wiper motor, mounted it on the fender, and told Eddie, "Pump this every 30 seconds or the engine dies." It was chaos. It was dangerous. It was completely against every maintenance protocol in the U.S. Army. And it worked. By 6:42 a.m., 44 tanks were running. 3 remained, one with a blown engine, one with a destroyed turret ring, and one that had taken a direct hit to its ammunition storage and was genuinely unsalvageable. Frank made the call. "Those 3 we destroy. The rest we move. Now." They set thermite grenades in the 3 hopeless cases, pulled the pins, and ran. The grenades hissed and melted through the steel, sending white-hot streams of molten iron through the engine blocks. Meanwhile, the convoy of 44 Shermans began rolling west, a long, battered, smoking, but moving line of resurrected tanks, limping through the snow toward friendly lines. Frank rode in the last one, standing in the commander's hatch, watching the road behind them. At 7:03 a.m., German artillery rounds began landing 2 miles to their east. The scouts had arrived. But by then, Frank and his 44 tanks were gone. They made it back to Allied lines by 9:15 a.m. The convoy rolled into a forward assembly area near Spa, and for a moment, no one spoke. Soldiers stared. Officers came running. Mechanics walked among the tanks in disbelief. These were supposed to be destroyed. Instead, they were here. Damaged, yes. Smoking, yes. But operational. A colonel from division headquarters arrived within the hour. He walked the line of resurrected tanks, inspecting each one, then found Frank sitting on the rear deck of a Sherman, drinking cold coffee from a canteen. "Sergeant Audrey?" Frank stood. "Yes, sir." "You were ordered to destroy these vehicles?" "Yes, sir." "And you recovered them instead?" "Yes, sir." The colonel nodded slowly. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you're in?" "I can imagine, sir." The colonel looked at the tanks, then back at Frank. "These are worth approximately $50,000 each. You just saved the U.S. Army over $2 million in equipment. You also saved us from losing tactical parity in this sector." He paused. "But you also directly violated a lawful order, which is insubordination." Frank said nothing. "However," the colonel continued, "given the circumstances and the results, I'm choosing to interpret your actions as field initiative rather than disobedience." He extended his hand. "Well done, Sergeant." Frank shook it, too exhausted to feel relieved. Over the next 2 days, division maintenance crews went through every tank Frank had recovered. Out of the 44, 41 were deemed combat-ready after minor repairs. 3 required depot-level overhauls but were still salvageable. None had to be scrapped. The tanks were immediately reassigned to units that had lost their armor in the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge. They fought at Bastogne. They pushed through the Ardennes. Some made it all the way to Germany. One Sherman, the very first one Frank had jump-started with a homemade cable at 11:52 p.m. on December 18, was photographed crossing the Rhine River in March 1945. On the side of its turret, someone had painted the words, "Audrey's Miracle." Frank Audrey never received a medal for what he did that night. No Bronze Star, no commendation. The official record stated only that 44 disabled vehicles were recovered through field maintenance operations, with no mention of how, or by whom. But among the tankers and the mechanics, his name became a quiet legend. Crews who had lost their Shermans and thought they'd never fight again were suddenly reassigned to one of Frank's ghost tanks. When they asked how their new vehicle had survived, someone would inevitably say, "Frank Audrey pulled it out of the snow. Broke every rule in the book to do it." After the war, Frank returned to Detroit. He opened a small garage on the east side, specializing in engine repair. He never advertised. He never had to. Word of mouth was enough. Men who had served with him would drive across the state just to have him work on their cars. One veteran brought his son to meet Frank in 1958. The kid asked, "Is it true you saved 47 tanks in one night?" Frank, now gray-haired and wearing the same oil-stained coveralls he'd worn for 20 years, smiled. 44, he corrected. "The other 3 were too far gone." "How did you do it?" Frank shrugged. "Same way I fix anything. You figure out what's broken. You ignore what the manual says can't be done, and you make it work. And you don't quit, even when everyone tells you it's impossible." Frank Audrey died in 1991. His funeral was attended by over 200 people, including 14 men who had served in the 2nd Armored Division. One of them, a retired tank commander named Bill Harper, gave a brief eulogy. "Frank saved my life twice. Once by fixing my tank when I thought it was dead. And once by teaching me that sometimes, the right thing to do is the thing no one gives you permission to do." There's no statue of Frank Audrey, no street named after him. But his story didn't end in Belgium. It became a case study. By early 1945, word of what had happened reached the Ordnance Department in Washington. Engineers wanted to know how one man with minimal equipment had accomplished in 6 hours what doctrine said required days. Frank was summoned to provide a detailed report. He wrote it out by hand, 14 pages describing every improvisation. The jumper cable system, the fuel line heating technique, the battery series connection, the manual transmission override. He included sketches and recommendations. The Ordnance Department was horrified. Most of what he had done violated safety protocols. But they couldn't argue with the results. Over the next 6 months, several of Frank's techniques were quietly incorporated into revised field maintenance manuals. The jumper cable system became standard issue for recovery vehicles. The fuel line heating procedure was taught at maintenance schools. His method for diagnosing cold weather failures became part of winter warfare training. They never credited him by name, but the ideas lived on. In Korea, when American tanks faced similar cold weather breakdowns, mechanics used Frank's techniques to recover vehicles under fire. In Vietnam, his improvisation methods influenced the battle damage repair doctrine that kept helicopters flying. Even today, U.S. Army recovery teams are taught a principle that traces back to Frank's actions in 1944. Assess, adapt, recover. Don't accept a loss until you've exhausted every option. But perhaps the most important legacy wasn't technical, it was cultural. Frank's story, passed quietly among mechanics and crew chiefs, became a reminder that expertise matters more than rank, that field experience can outweigh engineering theory. That sometimes, the people who know the machines best aren't the ones who designed them, they're the ones who have to fix them in the mud. There's a reason the U.S. military has always prized its maintainers. They see problems as puzzles, not obstacles. They value function over form. They know that perfection is the enemy of operational, and operational is what wins wars. Frank Audrey embodied that mindset. He didn't care if his fixes were pretty, he cared if they worked. He didn't follow the manual because the manual was written for ideal conditions, and war is never ideal. He trusted his hands, his experience, and his instinct. And because of that, 44 tanks that should have been destroyed went on to fight another day. How many lives did Frank Audrey save that night? There's no way to know. But this is the hidden truth of war. It's not just won by generals or pilots, it's won by people like Frank. The invisible army behind the army. Frank never sought glory because he knew his job wasn't about glory. It was about making sure the machines worked so the soldiers could do theirs. In the end, he didn't just save 44 tanks on a frozen road in Belgium. He saved the idea that one person, working quietly with skill and determination, can change the outcome of something much larger than themselves, not by following orders blindly, but by understanding when to set them aside and do what's right. In a war defined by destruction, Frank Audrey spent one freezing December night doing the opposite. He built, he repaired, he recovered. And in doing so, he reminded everyone around him that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do in the face of chaos is simply refuse to let good things die.